Okay, we are now going to move to our panel discussion. And you can see that this panel discussion is taking a look at the effect of the 21st Century Cure Act on oncology and opportunities to advance accessible cancer care. This session is going to run for about an hour to 35 minutes after the hour. That's 3:35 Eastern. We'll go to Q&A around 3:15, 3:25, 3:20, 3:25, something like that. So we'll go to Q&A there, and you might want to sort of gin up your questions for that. With regard to this session, we've seen the 21st Century Cures Act in place since about 2016. We're starting to see some of the impacts of it. Some surprises here and there. Some things are working as planned. And of course, our external contextual environment makes things a lot more complicated, obviously. And so what we want to get from this next panel is understanding what the opportunities are to really advance accessible cancer care in this context, arising from, in great measure, though not entirely, from the 21st Century Cure Act. And we're going to want to look ahead as well to that. And I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce herself or himself in alphabetical order, and not a traditional bio, but Jenny, starting with you, kind of, name, title, and all that. But what is it about what you do, Jenny, in your roles that pertains directly or is has felt the impact directly of the 21st Century Cure Act? What's kind of the intersection there for you? Jenny Ahlstrom will give us a good start.
Okay, so my name is Jenny Ahlstrom. I'm founder of the CrowdCare Foundation and the Myeloma Crowd. I'm also a myeloma patient, and we have built a platform called Health Tree that we'll talk about a little bit later, I think, that enables patients to use their information and then share that collectively. So this act is really important for what we're working on.
Great, thanks very much, Jenny. Well stated. Clay, what's your role here?
Sure, Clay Alspach from Leavitt Partners. And my role here is when I worked on Capitol Hill for the Energy and Commerce Committee, I helped put together the 21st Century Cures Act. And since its enactment, I've been following its implementation. So just great to be part of this, and thanks for the opportunity to participate on the panel.
Thank you. So Clay was in the room where it happened. Okay. Dr. Anobel Odisho, please.
Hi, my name is Anobel Odisho. I'm one of the urologic surgeons in urologic oncology at UCSF, University of California, San Francisco. And I also spend time at the Center for Digital Health Innovation at UCSF, and I lead virtual care. So I spend a lot of time both taking care of urologic oncology patients, but also developing digital patient engagement solutions. And so we use and rely on a lot of these APIs as we integrate data from third parties to try to reach patients and better enable their care.
Excellent, great. Is Susan Stiles on?
Hi, this is Susan Stiles.
There you are, good, hi.
Hi. I'm the executive at Cerner Corporation for Oncology Business Line, and I would say that the impact here obviously is around EHR data and interoperability, being an open platform to really be able to embed and exchange data for the patient care.
Great, thank you very much, Susan. So for our audience's sake, I want to try to name some of the topics we hope to cover in this hour. Not sure we can get to all of them, but the topics we hope we can get to are as follows. We're going to want to know from this group, what's changed? What's changed since Cures? Second, what about access to information? What has occurred there, and where do we stand with regard to access to information? Next, real world evidence, real world data. We've heard our previous speakers address that, but what has grown out of Cures and where we headed with RWE? Next, clinical trials. We know that there are certain quite specific and far-reaching provisions of Cures regarding clinical trials. Where do we stand there? Got to ask the next question about the impact of COVID. It's changing so many things, And as we're thinking about the impact of Cures 1.0, how's it going to have an impact in Cures 2.0? Patient-focused drug development was also an important aspect of Cures. How has that changed, really, or just in theory? And any remaining gaps. So as you can see, there's a lot we'd like to cover here. We will do our best. And as I said before, we're going to go to questions and answers around 3:20, 3:25, something like that. So if you want to queue up a good question, you know how to do it, and do let us know. So we'll put Clay on the spot first. Clay, since you were there, you helped write this thing. What can you say overall has changed since the 3.5 years that Cures has been enacted, whether it's biomedical research, other advancements, and how might it apply to cancer care? So what's happened now?
Absolutely. I think, one, I can't believe it's been 3.5 years. It's gone by pretty fast. But I think as we've heard today through the great discussion, Jeff and Ron, Lee walked through a number of the authorities, and then through your conversations with Dr. Abernathy and Dr. Rucker, it's clear that there's been an impact, there have been advancements. And so I'll just go through a few just to give folks an example. Sure. Specifically in the areas of medical products, digital health, and biomedical research. Just to highlight in the medical product area, I think one of the authorities that has really made a difference in oncology is the Oncology Center of Excellence at FDA. The 21st Century Cures Act gave FDA the ability to establish this center. And I think through the center, what it's done is brought together the different silos at FDA on oncology. So where you have a drug, a biologic, a device, basically they will be and go through this OCE, Oncology Center of Excellence, and have the experts in cancer ensure that they're part of that process. And because of that, I think we've seen tremendous amount in the last few years in terms of products coming forward, whether it's just to name some, just 11 new molecular entities to 3 biosimilars, 4 pre-market approvals just in 2019. So I think it's made a real difference. Another one that you heard about earlier today is the Regenerative Medicine Advanced Therapy designation. This RMAT designation is critical. The idea is to grant authority to FDA to help expedite the review of these just different and new novel therapies. An example of the products that are involved in this are the CAR-T products that we've heard so much about in the last few years. In the digital health space, and we've had a lot of conversation today around digital health, but it's appropriate. It's so important to a lot of what we're doing today in oncology. One is real-world evidence. Real-world evidence, I think what 21st Century Cures did, and Dr. Abernathy talked about this, is it established a framework or enabled FDA to put forward a framework on real-world evidence that I think we're seeing benefits in oncology, but also outside of oncology as well with COVID. Because of that framework, because of the work that FDA has done, we're seeing it now today as to this evidence can be utilized. In particular on oncology though, as Dr. Abernathy again referenced, there was authority that was clarified. I think it was already there, but just clarified in 21st Century Cures that real-world evidence can be utilized as part of post-market applications, supplemental applications. And that was actually done for a breast cancer drug where basically electronic medical health records and post-marketing reports were utilized for that supplemental approval for that indication in breast cancer. So that's just one example. Dr. Rucker spent a good amount of time talking about interoperability. That is one of the areas that continues to be a huge advance. Just bringing stakeholders together and using the power of the federal government, whether through CMS or ONC, to help basically make patients more informed around their ability, their opportunities, and their data, so they can be part of decision making. I think was one of the critical pieces that I know Chairman Alexander from the Health Committee and Ranking Member Murray in particular were huge advocates of, and we're seeing the benefits of that today. And then finally, on biomedical research, we all know how important funding is to move forward advancements. And in the research area, $1.8 billion came forward from the 21st Century Cures Act. I think that we're continuing to see the benefits of that, but it is one where, as we look at a Cures 2.0 or future legislation, I think there's concern about the fact that there is this does end in a few years. And so what can be done to ensure that these valuable resources will continue in the future? So clearly a lot has been done, and just back to you, Cliff, for further discussion on it.
Yeah, just before we get away from you on this, Clay, so if someone is telling the story, let's say of CAR T therapies, if someone's telling that story, would you vouch for saying that 21st Century's Cure did give a little juice to that? Did it have something to do with CAR T?
Yeah, I think it's had a role, right? It's not the reason for it, but I think it's helped have a role and set a foundation. I think important for all of this discussion is not just around, what specific sections I cited from the law, I just went through that, but it's also about setting a mindset and allowing and embracing innovation as a whole for our health ecosystem. And I think that's where 21st Century Cures, we spent a lot of time, legislating, but also time basically trying to bring segments of that whole healthcare ecosystem together. And that allows innovations or enables innovations like CAR T, where we've seen basically come forward. Now, it's not without its challenges. I think Jeff talked about it earlier around the CMS role, and we've seen it with reimbursement with CAR T about some of the issues of first impression that had to be resolved by CMS and other payers around that. But I think it's one where 21st Century Cures, listen, I'm biased here, but I think it did have a role in helping.
Okay, good to know that. So Jenny, Clay just ran through a rather impressive laundry list of accomplishments that seem to have flowed from Cures. Do you concur, and did he miss anything? Any other particular angles?
Well, I think progress is being made, and I think there's a lot more we need to do. I mean, just with what Dr. Rucker was talking about earlier, it's great to see things advance, and I think people have not really understood like what patients might want to do with their own data as you open things up. The first thing you could do with your data is to potentially just aggregate it into a single place for your own benefit. But really, the value comes when you aggregate it for yourself. Like I'm seeing it at 3 different cancer facilities. So I wanted a system where I could put everything in a single place, but I also wanted to be able to compare myself. So it's only when the data becomes correlative is it really truly valuable. And I think people they've thought about it from a correlative research standpoint, but not a correlative patient standpoint, I think, before. So that's kind of where I'd like to see things headed.
So not all the linkages are just yet in place. I think we've heard from Dr. Abernathy, Dr. Rucker about some advances in those directions. Anobel, I would guess you've got something to say about that issue.
Yeah, I agree that it's so important to have these super aggregators, like Jenny discussed. Obviously, in the past few years, patients have had a lot more access to their individual data through the increasing utilization of patient portals. But we're also seeing these overlay services that can take advantage of APIs and standards like FHIR to pull data in from multiple different sources and get them in one place to be able to bring that context. We haven't had access to much information about patients across health systems. Mm-hmm. And as we get that information together, we then need to build, there's the system of record, but then on top of that, the system of engagement, the system of experience that builds upon those.
It's interesting, just if one looks at your very title, Anobel, you're in a family comprehensive cancer center and you're into digital health. And if we want to deliver comprehensive care, it would seem that we'd want to use digital health in a way that Jenny just described. And so in your day-to-day work and practice, how big is that remaining gap, Anobel?
It's a challenge between what we want to deliver and what our systems enable us to deliver. The majority of our systems, like I discussed, let's say a major medical record system, it's for keeping records. And so it's difficult to build that logic into that system that helps us with clinical decision support, patient engagement, patient support, survivorship. a simple example of, patient-reported outcomes. We certainly want to make sure we're engaging patients, understanding what their recovery is like, getting their specific patient-reported outcomes at certain time points. But how do we define what those specifically are for each disease state, and how do we standardize those across multiple different institutions, and making sure they're all called the same thing so a patient can aggregate their own data.
Got it. So that might have gotten a bit of a boost from the Cures Act, but could use yet another boost from maybe 2.0. Susan Stiles, you're in an industry that one would expect would have felt an impact, a set of impacts from Cures. What can you tell us about any changes that have come to your attention or of which you are aware? And I think Susan might be on mute.
Sorry about that.
You're good now.
Sorry about that. I think we've seen a great impact from the Cures Act where I work. And one of that really kind of comes around to having tighter, better standards of, for the language, widely accepted, standardized, so that obviously we can talk across different vendors or across different systems. The APIs or the FHIR standards have been significant as well to help us look at pieces that are gaps possibly in the EHR, fill those gaps with other smart apps that are really created across the industry to help us move those things forward, embed them within the EHR so that data can be available at the right time, at the right place for the right provider to make those treatment decisions. And so we're seeing that now with some of our Cerner records and being able to bring in that data for treatment decisions. For instance, in our oncology software, we can embed a patient-reported outcome app that's right within the workflow of the clinician, therefore bringing in survey results, even alerting us if there is a high alert to whether it's a pain score or a nausea score that we want to prevent that patient from going to the ER hospitalization. So we help really take action on that and create and help prevent those type of things, creating obviously better outcomes, hopefully keeping the patient on treatment modalities as well.
Got it. And from the standpoint of Cerner, Susan, do you kind of track what's going on Capitol Hill and so forth, insofar as kind of what's in the pipeline perhaps for 2.0? Is this something that I don't know, government affairs folks really care about a lot and are kind of monitoring, kind of bird dogging?
Absolutely. We're very active in that, I would say, as well. So following that active, we have participation from some of our teams, lobbying as well, but also on the work that Dr. Rucker talked about, have some very active participants in that as well.
Good, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Jenny, on this, Jenny, Anobel, maybe Susan as well. Access to information, Jenny, you kind of got into this a little bit a moment ago when you talked about your data is in like your data are in 3 different places. So that has to do with sort of fragmentation of data, but what can you say about any changes that have been occurring to improve or somehow change patient access to data?
Well, I think the patient portal is a good start, but it's not, what I said earlier is really true. It has to be correlative. I have to compare myself. What I really wanted when I was diagnosed is show me all the patients that have the same type of cancer that I do. What did they get for treatment? What were their outcomes? Because I want to pick the therapy that's getting people out the longest. And just nothing like that existed. So as we researched this, we realized that right now, maybe in the future this will change, but right now patients are the only ones who can pull their information together and who can build a system to do that. So that's why we were so focused on creating this platform that we could then compare ourselves to other people. And that includes, I think very little information actually holistically is in the EHR. I think we heard from Dale Sanders at Health Catalyst, one of the largest data technology companies, that only 8% is in the EHR. Now, that may be different in oncology, but where's the other 92%? Like it's at the allergy office, or it's in, at your chiropractors, or it's in your head. So like I know my family history of cancer. I can include that. I know my family history of other diseases. It's kind of like the intake form that you fill out at other facilities, at a facility when you go. But it's in a single place now. So now I can compare myself to other people with my same genetic features or lab features or diagnoses using this HealthTree tool that we just built for myeloma.
So it's not just bringing together your own data from all
Right.
these disparate places, whether it's 8% or something a little higher than that. It's also when data are brought together that way, any one patient can compare herself or himself to that same cohort, a similar cohort of patients,
Right.
and learn that much more. And of course, that what you just said echoes directly with what Amy Abernathy was saying she's trying to accomplish as well. From a national standpoint, can we enable that? Anobel, is that ringing true to you as well?
You know, absolutely. I think there's two pieces of it. One, patients having access to their data, and two, the data being there in a structured, interpretable format. So to Jenny's point, you know, in urology, we'll send lots of genomic tests. Let's say a test like a Decipher test. It's you know, multiple millions of dollars went into developing this. It's a high-end, high-tech test. We can theoretically get a lot of detailed genetic information, and it costs patients a lot of money. But the results of that test out of a multi-million-dollar machine, I receive as a scanned photocopy of a fax, right? And so that is not available to Jenny to be able to compare with the rest of her other patients like her. So
That's in the
it's
92%, right?
that's exactly right. So it might as well, it's there, but it might as well be invisible. Now, for a while, that almost didn't matter because there was no ability to build applications to take advantage of structured data. And so we meet this from both ends. As health IT developers build the applications, the gaps are more and more evident. And so it puts a little bit of pressure on either the electronic health record companies or how that electronic health record is actually implemented at each individual institution and the providers to use those structured fields. So in cancer, stage is incredibly important. And all major electronic health record systems have the ability to enter a patient's cancer stage, pathology, grade, but it's not always utilized. So again, that falls into that 92%.
Got it. Point well taken. Clay or Susan, any further insights briefly on access to information, the access part in particular? Clay or Susan?
I
Susan.
think I'll go ahead real quick. I think one of the goals, you know, at Cerner that we've seen with the EHR is, you know, for 3 decades, we've been really an EHR company where we really are gathering patient data in an integrated fashion for a health system. But really what we see ourselves as in the future is a platform company. So that the ability to be an open platform, to be able to utilize data across systems, right? And be able to bring the data in a standardized format. Genomic data that Anobel just talked about is very tough because we really haven't had a standard language for genomic information. Some of those things have come along here recently where we can start really developing that. Hope some of the genomic labs will also help implement and develop that so that we can start seeing some of that together. And I think the other piece that we really see part of our future is, and we're working towards developing, is the patient owns the data in the medical record. So how do we continue developing to where the patient has the access to the data in the medical record? And like Jenny mentioned, being able to correlate it, collaborate it together, and bring it together in their own data set as they need.
I'd like to be a fly in the wall with a conversation between your company, Jenny, and people that think about things like HIPAA and intellectual property and all that kind of stuff. So, good
Right.
God, that might be an interesting conversation, like ownership.
It definitely will be, especially sharing data between family members, right?
Among others.
That's a tough one, right? Yes.
Wow. Clay, any further point on that?
I would just say, I think that this has been a conversation that has continued, but because of the rules finally came forward from CMS and from ONC, I think that's been a huge development. Now folks can, in the policy world and in the stakeholders who have to implement it, have a good understanding as to where the rules of the road are and can now we can move forward just to see on these questions of who owns it and you know how it's implemented. We have the answers. And from a legislative side, and you may get into this further when representatives Upton and DeGette are there. It's been hard to legislate, frankly, because there was just waiting for that step to take place. Not to say the legislation is necessarily imminent, but now that those rules are here, that may generate some more activity on the Hill around.
Clay, quick digression. What rule or rules have made that difference to which you refer?
Sure, there were the interoperability and the security rules that came forward from CMS and from ONC. So those are the rules I'm talking about.
Got it. Good. I want to move. Oh, sure. Oh, for the comments? I'm sorry. I heard an echo. Okay. I want to move to real world evidence. Susan and then Jenny on this. So as a result of cures, and in particular from your own perspective, Susan as an EHR vendor, Jenny as a patient and advocate and data, I guess, aggregator yourself, what can you say about the impact in real world evidence? Susan?
Well, I would say that we really see the ability to drive a longitudinal story across time as really key with that clinical evidence. I think the usage of that and the benefits or even risks of that really help produce better outcomes. I believe that we really need to be able to pull together health records, claims data, the registries, ePros, just like Dr. Abernathy was talking about, really being able to collate and collaborate with those pieces of data in a data ecosystem. I think that really helps improve both the outcomes, but also the benefits to our patients. ePros are probably very key, so how they report and record how they're feeling throughout treatment cycles, how we can prevent hospitalizations and ER visits through being able to take action on those quicker, and just help with even patient navigation through the whole system and whole process.
Good, thanks. So Jenny, does that ring true to you?
Yeah, I think what Susan says is really important. So the benefits back to patients is this kind of novel concept, in my opinion. There are a lot of data registries out there where we say, okay, well, dump your data here and you're doing good for the community. And there are always patients that are willing to do that, and that's fantastic. But it doesn't incent you, especially when you're not feeling good or going through cancer treatment or have a terminal disease, to maintain the data, keep it updated. And so you have to provide specific benefits and identify specific benefits that go back to patients. So what we've tried to do with this HealthTree platform is create a longitudinal, lifelong relationship with the patient from the time they get diagnosed throughout the entire course of their lifetime, to provide either education, to provide, oh, you know, now you can see your treatment options, now you can find clinical trials that you actually fit the eligibility criteria for. You can join studies, you can answer survey questions for research. So like, for example, because we had a relationship, I think we have over 6,000 myeloma patients in this tool now, we were able to go and say, do you want to participate in a COVID study? So we had, I think, 1,100 patients register for this COVID study in a 4-week period. And I think that's kind of unheard of, to try to recruit 1,000 patients into an observational clinical study in a 4-week period. We're also doing a study with Roswell Park on fitness, and we're doing a study with University of Arizona on like alternative therapies. We can keep going back to the patients and say, hey, do you want to join this study? Hey, do you want to join this study? We fill out this survey, and they're getting benefits back. They're able to see all the data and all the results. And so providing that back to patients is essential.
What you're amassing then sounds like a whole diverse set of data streams that are somehow patient sourced or patient generated, and which are basically our real world data sources, right?
It's real world clinical, yeah, it's clinical data. So it's lab values, and some we're able to import through Apple Health with the FHIR API for that. We have them add genetics, we have them add prior lines of therapy, we have them add side effects, and patient-reported outcomes. And so it's this comprehensive view of the patient. So we were able to run a psoriasis myeloma study and see if there were any correlations between those two diseases and those types of things.
And much of what you're talking about is outside the traditional realm of prospective RCTs and so forth. These are different kinds of largely real-world data streams.
Yes.
Clay, is this sounding like music to your ears insofar as what Cures might have had in mind?
Yeah, it's outstanding. I think a lot of what we talked about in Cures is theoretical and on paper. To hear it in practice and reaching patients and recruitment is unbelievable. It's so great to hear that.
Good. I want to move to clinical trials impact. We usually do it in the reverse order. Usually talk about clinical trials first and real world data second, but one of the most important sets of provisions in the Cures Act had to do with basically certain ways to modernize clinical trials. And maybe we could go to Anobel and then perhaps back to Clay to kind of drill down a little bit more. So in your view, has Cures had an effect, one or more impacts on how we do clinical trials? Anobel?
Yeah, I think there are a couple key issues. One we've discussed being real world evidence, the use of patient-reported outcomes and patient-generated health data, support for surrogate endpoints, and support for some non-traditional statistical modeling. I think it'll be slow because the technology has to follow, the technology has to lead, and that's been a little bit of a challenge. Clinical trials are designed far in advance, and they take a long time to accrue and a long time to report out because you generally, historically, have been waiting for overall survival or cancer-specific survival outcomes. And so one of the pushes is to look at some of these surrogate endpoints, such as patient experience, pain, symptoms, labs, imaging. But it's going to take a little bit of time to redesign the way clinical trialists think, and also how clinical trials are performed with these surrogate endpoints.
So what you just described, it doesn't sound like what you said is about redesigning clinical trials, but you are enriching them with these other kinds of data, lab values and so forth. So Clay, what else would have flowed from the Cures Act insofar as affecting clinical trial design, adaptation, what have you?
I think one of the pieces is just the conversation around an adaptive clinical trial design, just innovative ways with which to move forward. I think that's one area, frankly, that needs more work. Is just to better support that with research as well as just proving those methods. Because as Anobel said, I mean, these are clinical trials, right? And you want to make sure they're done right. With rigor, the process is very important. It's not a place for experimentation. And so I think it's just more work needs to be done there. I think you'll not only in legislation, but I think just from the FDA standpoint is providing additional guidance and just moving forward in that direction.
Clay, are you satisfied with how FDA has responded to the provisions in Cures? Have they done a good job along those lines?
Yeah, I think they've done an outstanding job. When you look at the implementation and how they structured it, it was clear they, took it very seriously. And you can look at just some of the charts and the availability, the transparency around their implementation. They track it very closely, have the provisions there. And so I think from a congressional, perspective, looking on the agency, they've done, I think, a tremendous job, not only in clinical trials, but you mentioned real world evidence. You can see it in that regard as well. Just a number of steps they've taken to move forward in that with the implementation. And I think that doesn't always happen, frankly, from the executive end. But this is one of those cases where FDA definitely has done a tremendous job. Good.
Jenny, are you seeing anything that has come from Cures or evolved from Cures that has affected clinical trials in any one or more of conditions in oncology?
Yeah, I don't know how to answer that. I know that there's been more emphasis on real world data, like we talked about earlier. Mm-hmm. I think that emphasis I've seen with very large scale, even pharmaceutical supported clinical trials. So I think there's just been, I think that's all I would say about
more. Well, I'll just ask you the little follow-up then. What is anything lacking from your standpoint in the clinical trials world that needs to be addressed? Whether it's recruitment, diversity, representation of ages and genders and so forth?
Oh my.
Shortfalls?
That's a very long discussion. But I think in general, clinicaltrials.gov is extremely hard to use for patients. You cannot find a trial you are eligible to join based on your inclusion criteria that's easy to use. So that's why when we were looking at this holistic solution, we think patients should be joining clinical trials. And it's sad that 5% of patients are joining that are adult cancer patients. So that was one of the big emphasis and points we were trying to make with the patient programs that we created to educate patients about clinical trials, but also to facilitate clinical trials. So we partnered with another organization called SparkCures, and we can match now all the clinical trials that you are actually eligible to join by passing your lab value data, like your creatinine level or your platelet count or whatnot. So instead of this 450 list of open myeloma trials, you see a list of 10 or 20 that you're actually eligible to join. And then they provide a support resource so you can call a phone number and say, I want to get into this trial. How do I join? So now you can actually navigate the clinical trials process, but really that needs to happen. I think this is the only cancer that this happens for, and it's one cancer, so we should be doing that for every cancer.
Well, your point, I'm so glad I did ask you that question because clinicaltrials.gov did represent an important breakthrough in sort of transparency for clinical trials, but you just explained how it only goes so far. It doesn't sound like there's a lot of direct, what shall I say, user friendliness for cancer patients.
It's very hard to use as a patient. It's fine if you want to understand what studies are being run in a disease state, and you get a sense of which trials are being run. But from a patient standpoint, you look at the list of 450, you read a couple, and then you say, I have no clue, like I don't even understand the drug classes, so how am I going to find one that I can actually get into? And
that sounds like something
for me.
That sounds like something we can fix. I mean, you're kind of doing your own fix on it. So note to the National Library of Medicine and those who fund it. Clay, I saw you nodding your head there. Is that something that you would see as a type of priority there? Is that something we can fix?
Yeah, I definitely think so. As we had our discussion, as part of our working group, I know that's one thing that did come up as part of the discussions among the experts. And I think it's an area for Cures 2.0 where just that there has been work on it, I think on the part of NIH and FDA, but it's in hearing from patients, there's just more work that has to be done to make it as effective as possible.
Got it. So Susan and/or Anobel, anything further on clinical trials? I don't want to miss anything. Susan, anything further?
Yeah, I was just going to mention, I think this is another area where technology can really help us too. Obviously machine learning or AI, but really looking at a patient's data and then what the inclusion exclusion criteria are, connecting that to the right pieces to really help narrow down that path of what they're eligible for. So I really can see some of those future pieces helping really with that process and getting us a little closer. It doesn't mean that probably we won't still have for a while eyes on it, a person also, making sure that those things are meant in the correct way. But I do think technology could help lead us down the path a little bit further.
So there's a lot we can do around clinical trials to make it easier for patients to get enrolled, to use the information, even for the research community. Anobel, any final word on clinical trials?
It's having diversity in our clinical trial population is so important. There was a study that looked at about 170 recent molecular agents approved by the FDA, and 20% of them had differences in exposure or response across racial and ethnic groups. So, we need to make sure that everyone's being represented in these trials. The African American population is about 13% of the US population, makes up 5% of trial participants. Hispanic population is about 18% of the US, makes up 1% of trial participants.
1%?
So it's a really important issue. And there are a lot of barriers. Some of them are outside the scope of some easy technological fixes relatively, right? The technology, we've been saying how it's so hard, but relative to some of these other issues might be the easy part. And we're doing a couple things to try to address those. So for example, we discussed pathology being so centrally important to cancer. We're collaborating at UCSF with the Greater Bay Area Cancer Registry and electronic path reporting for early case ascertainment to identify new diagnoses and then proactively reach out to those patients, right? So to really help bolster enrollment. In urology, we've integrated Salesforce into our electronic health record system. And so we load our clinical trial eligibility criteria and then are using some of the patient data factors, whether it's pathology, labs, other related things, to screen patients and identify if they're eligible for trials, which then goes through a manual verification process by our clinical research coordinators to say, yes, this was right, this was not. Now, in doing that, we're doing two things. One, we're making a lot more patients aware and eligible for clinical trial enrollment. But two, we're also building a training set, which has been human verified, which we can then go back and build machine learning models based on to then identify maybe more broadly which patients would be eligible for different trials.
Got it. So cures did give a boost to clinical trials in certain ways, but all four of you have identified some very important remaining gaps. And some of them aren't just gaps, they're wounds. Anobel, thanks for quoting those stats on African-American representation in clinical trials and Hispanic. Talk about disparities. So 13% of the population, 5% of the trial enrollment, Hispanics with 20+% of the population, 1%. Those are, I guess, inexcusable disparities. And so the things that you just mentioned are the kinds of things we need to be addressing in Cures 2.0 as well as elsewhere. Yeah. Speaking of current events, impact of COVID. So I know we can take this in a lot of directions. And actually, most of our previous speakers have been talking about some of these issues as well. COVID has had a very broad impact across the board. And I want to bring it back to Cures 1.0 to Cures 2.0. And I'm going to go back to Clay again. So when folks are working on Cures 1.0, some far-reaching people, maybe yourself, were thinking, and wait till we get to 2.0. So now this pandemic has happened in the interim. Clay, has COVID or will COVID redirect, bend, or otherwise alter where you see the evolution in the Cures 2.0?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the answer is yes. One area is on real-world evidence where we're seeing in COVID and with the utilization of the antivirals or just the role that real-world evidence can help in providing information on what's working, what's not working. I think one question before 2.0, as 2.0 was being developed and is being developed, was basically, as we talked about earlier, taking like some of the theoretical and making it real. So where and how you utilize real-world evidence as part of some of these supplemental applications that are authorized as part of it. Now that we have these specific instances where real-world evidence can be seen and we're testing whether it's the data sources or the data quality, some of these other elements, I think that's going to move it forward, very fast. A second area where we tried to touch on Cures, but we didn't really get into it, and I think others on the panel will have some experiences on telehealth, and on telehealth where, frankly, it's been a reimbursement issue from a congressional standpoint because it has just been viewed by the Congressional Budget Office as just so expensive. And so I think that was the major barrier in moving it forward. Telehealth, right, has been essential to patient care in our pandemic. Now that I think one of the questions that's being examined right now, Administrator Verma was speaking about it yesterday, is, listen, that telehealth is, I think folks want telehealth to be here to stay. There's into that question about what really telehealth means and the level of involvement, the technology utilized, a lot of pieces to it. But I think it's one where even before or as part of Q 2.0, maybe separate, may come sooner, that this telehealth discussion needs to be had about how we ensure that as part of our public programs, federal programs, that capability can be utilized.
Now, this includes, of course, the issue of reimbursement, payment for telehealth.
Absolutely. That's it. Yep.
That's been the bone of contention for what, 2+ decades, Clay?
Yep.
Good gosh. So I'm wondering, Susan, in your kind of electronic health world and so forth, you're with the HRs, but where do you see COVID having an impact on encouraging or helping to support telehealth? And might that affect your industry?
Absolutely. We really have. We actually partner with some telehealth companies, to provide a combined solution for our clients around telehealth and their EHR. Part of that, though, I think that impacts oncology the most is really around being able to help with that remote patient monitoring too. So combining in that piece as well, so you can really have a multi-pronged approach to kind of watching patients with symptom monitoring. Survivorship is probably another great way to really utilize that. I think we saw during the pandemic, some of the sources I have seen is around a 50% reduction in referrals to oncologists during this time. But so watching and treating the current patients on treatment, obviously coming into the infusion center was still very important to receive their care, but then doing follow-up care, symptom monitoring, survivorship type visits were very key, and would really like to see those things continue. We really see that all being combined together with the EHR and providing, again, the right data at the right time for that visit, and keeping that longitudinal patient story in front of them too. So as you're not seeing them in the office, right, how do you have all the right data for that visit as well, right in front of you, pertaining to following that story and that longitudinal care as they go forward. So I think it's very key. I was just saying, I think it's very key, and I think that it is here to stay from what we see. And I think what I've heard more from oncologists is around that reimbursement piece.
So is there then a seamless or near seamless interface between a telehealth visit and your EHRs, your company's EHRs? Is that seamless, instant?
Yes, we can do that with being able to visualize. And the patients can use the patient portal to log in to the telehealth visit. And then you can also see the patient through that telehealth visit, and your EHR is right with you during that visit. So,
got it.
If they're using telehealth, some of the in the interim, Zoom and some other things were used, or webcast. Those things are a little bit different outside of that process. So more work for that part.
So thank you, Susan. So Anobel and then Jenny, on this issue of telehealth, has COVID really given it a discontinuous leap here? And do you think that the improvements in telehealth that are experienced now are going to stick, or will they recede when we hope the pandemic recedes? Anobel?
Yeah, so, at UCSF, we had a pretty strong investment in telehealth. Since 2015, physicians internally were being given workload credit for telehealth visits, even though there was no external reimbursement for them. And so we were already at our cancer center, about 8% of our visits being telehealth, and a majority of our providers had tried it at least. And over a weekend, literally between March 15th and 17th, we went from 8% to 70% telehealth, and we're doing about 4,000 telehealth visits a week.
Wait, 8% to 70%?
At the cancer center.
In 2 days?
Yeah, basically every practice coordinator burned the weekend and got all the patients, because on Friday we got the directive saying no more in-person visits unless absolutely necessary. And so everybody burned the weekend, and we are doing 4,000 visits a week.
What a transition that must have been. My gosh.
And, patients, right now it's difficult to tell. Patients are very forgiving, and they're very thankful. One, they don't have another option. They can't come in, or they really don't want to come in. But two, they're also understanding that we're all in unprecedented times. The real question is going to be 2 months from now, 3 months from now, 8 months from now, hopefully, when we return to some sense of mobility and normalcy, will patients continue to opt for telehealth visits? And can we maintain a high quality experience? Right now, it's not really a fair comparison.
Got it.
But we're learning a lot. about what types of visits need to be done via telehealth. We thought it was only for patients that live far away, but plenty of patients that live in the city enjoy doing a telehealth visit and not having to take a half day off from work.
Wow. Well, I would think that Cures 2.0 would have to reflect those changes and what we learned through this pandemic. So, Jenny, does it scare the heck out of you as it scares the heck out of me that there's been this 50% drop to which Susan Stiles referred? That's scary to me. I think there might be a backlog in diagnosis and treatment, and gosh, could telehealth help us overcome that? What do you think, Jenny?
Yeah, we're hearing that too from a patient standpoint. We're hearing from the specialists that they're seeing more progressed disease. They're saying more bone deterioration. They're seeing higher M protein rates. I mean, they're seeing all that because people are delaying going in. So what Susan's saying is happening, and it is alarming. So the telehealth, I did it myself, and I loved it. It was very convenient. It was just as informative. And we're hearing, I think there have been some technical learning curve for a lot of people, getting the internet to work or whatnot. But once that's overcome, the visit itself, I've heard other myeloma specialists at UCSF say, we're surprised that how much myeloma care we can actually do via telehealth. And,
wow.
And it's been great.
So from your standpoint, if you saw sort of a pullback in telehealth post-pandemic, would you kind of fight that? Would that alarm you?
Yes, I would definitely, because a major issue in myeloma care and probably other cancer care as well is it's really important that you see a myeloma specialist. I think 80% of patients are in a general oncology setting, and 20% of patients obviously are a specialist. And there's data showing that you live longer if you go see a specialist. So could you get a second opinion via telehealth and provide that type of data to that physician trying to give you that consult? Yeah, we're working on adding that as well because we just think it's so important. Wow. It's really important for patients to get that second opinion.
Gosh, so we better kind of do our best to hold on to that, even though it was the pandemic that forced this. Let's see if we can hold on to it. By the way, we just did get a question that's right on point here, and I'll just read the question to you directly from one of our listeners. Could a telehealth session be recorded and then entered as part of the EHR, and then with artificial intelligence, use that to abstract information into structured data sets? Okay, so once again, telehealth session, recorded, input to the EHR, then apply AI to abstract information from that into a structured data set. I think I got that right, and I do appreciate the question. So Anobel, I saw you nodding, and I saw Susan nodding as well. So let's go Anobel and Susan first on that.
The answer is yes. We're actually piloting a version of that where it's not a video recording, it's real-time audio. It's a little device that's kind of like an Alexa made by a third-party vendor, and it listens into the visit and creates the note kind of in real time as structured data, and then someone reviews, and then the provider reviews the note and cosigns. So that's possible, and we're piloting it. Unclear how well it'll work.
So Alexa is listening, eh? Okay. Susan, do you have a viewpoint of that since EHRs were mentioned?
Absolutely. I agree with Anobel completely. Really looking at Alexa type devices for those listening pieces. And it is very key that it be structured data and discrete data, obviously as well. So it can be utilized for downstream work, such as like pathways or decision-making tools. So very much so. And we really see that being beneficial as we move forward.
Got it. So the things you've been saying last few minutes have generated a few more questions. I'll try to consolidate here, and it has to do with reimbursement. And the question is, there's concern that commercial payers are going to be choosing to discontinue reimbursement for telehealth appointments. And while in-person care is best, we might still need the flexibility to provide telehealth for patients in their home settings for all the reasons that folks have been describing. So, Clay, how do we deal with the possibility that commercial payers, maybe less so government, we'll find out, but the commercial payers may kind of pull back or regress on reimbursement for telehealth. And I'm just wondering if a case can be made for the cost effectiveness of telehealth. It would seem to be so, but I don't know if that work's been done. Clay?
Yeah, that's my question too. It's just whether it's less, you can make the argument from the payer standpoint that they could save money through these efforts. I will say on the congressional side and the federal side, this reimbursement does end when the declaration, public health emergency ends. And so I think Congress is going to have to step in order to make that continuation. So that is, I think what's one of the questions, frankly, around the pandemic. There have been a lot of authorities and enforcement discretion that's been utilized by CMS as well as FDA, is basically like how long that's going to last and how you move from what the transition looks like. So telehealth is one of the big questions where that has been, a lot of questions have been asked, but there are other areas as well, like emergency use authority as some examples where we're getting this access. So it's a great question. But I'm curious what others think about on the private side with the payers.
Well, but as you point out, some of the current stuff's going to expire, and it's going to require Congress to step up and do something, most likely, correct?
Yes, I would think so, unless CMMI or there's some type of model that can be put forward, but that would be a pretty broad, big model. So I would imagine Congress would have to play a role there.
Further comments on this from other panelists? Reimbursement pullback, perhaps. Anobel, how would you respond to that? Would that kind of put your operation into reverse there?
I think the university was able to absorb a certain percentage just because we thought it was the right thing to do. Probably wouldn't be able to absorb 70%, right? But I think patients are going to have a pretty strong voice. I tell patients, if you'd like to drive 3 hours for a 20-minute conversation, you're more than welcome to. If you want to do a telehealth visit, that's fine too. And they all choose a telehealth visit, right? We also have to consider the financial toxicity. And parking at our cancer center is about twice the cost of someone's insurance copay, right? And so for someone that needs to come for multiple visits over long periods of time, like an infusion, that can have a significant burden.
Wow. Okay, well, I think the business about the parking comes back often when surveys are done about satisfaction with healthcare and your healthcare provider. Parking rises to the first 1, 2, or 3 slots. It's been doing so for years. So this is another instance of that. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I want to make sure that each of you has an opportunity to now sit back and say, okay, we knew what Cures 1.0 was intended to do. We've been talking about what it has done. We started to see some emerging gaps and so forth. And I'd like to know from each of you what you think from your standpoint in the industry, as an industry, patient, provider, other, and or you as an individual, see as the most important remaining gaps to be filled by a Cures 2.0. How do we get to Cures 2.0? What are the gaps you've seen, particularly in light of all the changes that have happened, notwithstanding, in addition to pandemic, since 2016? So I want to see a hand for a volunteer. Who's going to go first? Gaps. Otherwise, I'll have to call on somebody. Okay. All right, we got a brave person here. Go ahead, Jenny. She's brave. What is it?
Well, I just see our biggest struggle because we're kind of brute forcing. We're getting some FHIR API data in right now, but the process to actually validate a patient account is really labor intensive. It's requesting the medical records, the paper records. It's having somebody go through them to see what their prior lines of treatment is because the portal's not right. I think it's data standardization is one of the biggest things that is needed, and ease of access of extracting the data in some kind of standardized form really is where I think things could be a lot better.
Okay, we'll take that. Data standardization and the comments you've made earlier in the hour certainly support that. I'll go to Anobel next. Anobel, the clinician perspective and or the comprehensive cancer center perspective.
And both, I think for us, the big issue is data interoperability and having these well-documented, strongly supported APIs, because that ecosystem will flourish. Just like, once the App Store opened up on your phone, I don't know if people remember when they first got their iPhones back in 2007, there was no App Store, right? It was locked down. There's no Uber without a Google Maps API, right? So I think part of that is just the finalization of the rules, because there was a little bit of a wait while developers were waiting to make massive investments. And so hopefully, I'm actually more hopeful that those are going to change soon.
Got it. Thank you. So we've got data standardization, interoperability, and a few others. Susan, Stiles, big gaps?
Yeah, I agree with both of those as large gaps. I think I will also go to really the piece about bringing in patient-reported data and really bringing the patient to the table with what they have, and obviously giving the patient the data that they need to continue their care throughout their life cycle. So I would probably hit on both of those.
Okay, patient-reported data and hitting on the whole life cycle. We've talked technically as well as clinically how that can be done. Excellent. Clay, maybe you'll be in the room where it happens yet again. So we're glad to give you some advice here. What have you heard and what would you add?
I would agree with everything that's been said. I would just say one area that we spent a little bit of time on that has been a big priority. I know that I care deeply about is the patient-focused drug development piece. And it's one that it was there before Cures, frankly. I think it was around through some of the user fee legislation, but Cures really helped put a framework together so that patient organizations and, patients in general can make sure that their views are represented as part of the regulatory process. And I think that it's one where, as much as I think it's a big priority, it really helps to reinforce that with policymakers as well as with FDA about how important that is, given how much they have to deal with and how many fires they have to put out. I think it always helps to make sure that priorities are reinforced and funded and shown to be something that that patients really care about. Because I think personally, I know for one, I participated in a psoriasis patient-focused drug development. I have psoriasis. It meant a lot to me, and I think it's one where, as we can try to incorporate patients into this process even more, just making sure that is a priority for Congress and for FDA and others, CMS, is going to be important.
Let's just, and we've got a minute. I want to dig into that just quickly, Clay. What is it about patient-focused drug development that's different than everything else we're doing? What is special about the development process, ever so briefly, if you mind?
Yeah, I think it comes down to, it's the risk-benefit calculus. And it's something where to know what a patient really cares about as he or she looks to take that drug, or what they should care about, is really important. And it's one where if a reviewer or a regulator can't guess, I think we have the technology now in order to make sure that to capture that and to put with rigor. And with that, I think, why not use that data to help that process? So as they're making decisions around oncology products, especially where just the acute nature of that, of oncology and cancer, just to make sure that is an important part of it. So
Got it. Well stated. Well, this has been a wonderful hour. If I ever wanted to ask anybody about where Cures was, what it's done, and where we need to go next, I really can't think of a better group to have put together here. And so I just think that, gosh, Jenny, your perspective as a patient has been wonderful, and the work you've actually done, the practical things you've done to bring data together are just great. And certainly, Anobel, I think that you stated some stats that knocked me out, and that 2-day turnaround is incredible. I haven't seen that in the literature yet, and I'd brag on that if I were you. And the problem is, a turnaround like that in 48 hours, they're going to ask you to do it again sometime. And then certainly Susan Stiles,
the paper's under review.
Yeah, okay. Susan, your industry and kind of what you've done at that particular company, it's very clear from all our discussion thus far that you're going to have kind of a critical role in that sort of a key role in that clinical pathway, that critical pathway, as a cog for interfacing data, collecting and so forth. And Clay, got to thank you for the original work you did leading up to 2016. And we very much hope that the discussion we all just had will provide input to you as you pursue the next iteration of that. So thank you all, Jenny Ahlstrom, Anobel, Odisho, Susan Stiles, Clay Alspach. Great session. And I'll now turn it back over to Bob Carlson. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you all, and thank you, Cliff.